Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. It's time for another episode of Rock and Read. Once again, I pulled this Eagles book from the nest. Today we'll be reading Chapter 3 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Let's get started. The radio in the polio ward first introduced me to the pleasures of music, but my father latched onto my early interest and used it as common ground. He'd always had some sort of stereo, no matter how poor we were, that played 33 and 45 RPM vinyls. By the time I was old enough to appreciate it, our home entertainment center, cobbled together from parts, was the biggest feature of our living room. After a hard day at work, Dad would come home, clean himself up, and kick back by listening to tapes. It was his only real escape from the life he had been born to. That and television, although I think we must have been the last family in Gainesville to buy a set. It was so big and tall, it looked like a wooden washing machine with a 12-inch screen. He'd borrow albums from friends, play them on his turntable, and record them on his second-hand Voice of Music tape recorder. He knew it was illegal duplication, but it was all he could afford. When he got tired of hearing something, he'd erase it, borrow a record from someone else, and tape that instead. Soon he had an extensive collection by the likes of Tommy Dorsey, Lawrence Welk, Benny Goodman, and Glenn Miller. I still can't hear Moonlight Serenade without thinking of my dad. Thanks to him, I had my first introduction to jazz and country music. Well, him and the Grand Ole Opry. We listened to that on WSM radio from the Ryman Auditorium until we acquired a television and could watch it live from Nashville on Friday and Saturday nights. Despite the poor quality of the set, we had the best reception in the neighborhood because Dad rigged up a sophisticated rotating antenna so that when the channel changed, a motor pointed it in the right direction. I thought that was pretty cool. I remember seeing Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show one Sunday night in 1957 and going wild. He sang Hound Dog, Heartbreak Hotel, and Love Me Tender, and I was completely blown away. Even though he was only shown from the waist up because of complaints about the sexual nature of the way Elvis the Pelvis danced, I'd never seen anybody move like that before. Soon afterward, there came a flood of music called rock and roll, and I knew right away that this was for me. Something about it really made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. My first introduction to the technical side of music also came through my father. One day, he called me over to his tape recorder, which consisted of two boxes, one with a reel-to-reel and a tiny 6x9 speaker, the other with a small amplifier and a second speaker. Without explaining anything, he set up a microphone, put it in front of me, and instructed, "Okay now, Doc, I want you to count every odd number aloud." I duly counted, 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. After rewinding the tape, he played it back and said, "Now, when you hear 1, start counting even numbers." Within minutes, he played the finished result back to me. Via the stereo sound-on-sound capability, I heard my voice on the left channel saying 1, then on the right channel saying 2. It was the first stereo overdub I had ever heard, and I thought, my God, this is incredible. I was hooked. First and foremost, I needed a guitar. The Elvis explosion had hit America, and a guitar was suddenly the coolest instrument to play. I'd been raised on a diet of Nashville guitar and banjo music, and there was no other instrument I was remotely interested in. By the time I was 11 years old, everybody on the block seemed to be playing guitar but me. Trouble was, I didn't have the money to buy one. Utterly despondent, I suddenly realized I might have something valuable to trade: cherry bombs. Jerry and I would buy them when we visited Uncle W.L. in Carolina, then bring them home to Florida, where they were illegal. If you threw one onto the concrete culvert in the ditch outside our home, it would make such a bang that all the kids in the street would come running, long before the cordite had dispersed. The boy directly across the street from us owned an acoustic guitar I badly wanted, so one day Jerry and I got going with the firecrackers. As planned, the kid came right out. "Hey, can I have some of those?" he asked, his eyes bright. "Sure," I said with youthful cunning, "but it'll cost you that old guitar on top of your closet." It was a horrible instrument, with 3 strings missing and full of holes, but it was my true first love. I took it to the drugstore and bought new strings with the last of my savings. A neighbor across the street taught me how to tune my new toy and work my way through these agonizing first D and G chords. I'd monopolized the sliding glider seat on my parents' front porch, strumming away for hours. I nearly wore it out. Later, with a little extra from Dad, I saved up what seemed like a fortune and spent $28 off to Sears Roebuck for a silver-toned archtop, which seemed to me like the height of musical sophistication. Every morning for a week I was late for school, waiting for the mailman to deliver it. I can still remember the pungent whiff of fresh varnish when I first opened the case. I had never had anything so glossy and shiny and new. I took unbelievably good care of that guitar. Everything else had been a hand-me-down from Jerry, his clothes, his shoes, even his old bike. This was the first possession I had that was mine and mine alone. Music was the only thing I was better at than Jerry. He could just about manage a couple of chords on the piano. It was also the only activity my father positively encouraged me in. The double incentive of pleasing Dad and being better at something than my brother was enough to make me want to do it real bad. Dad seemed to be genuinely excited by my enthusiasm for something other than daydreaming. Ever the innovator, he took the back off the television and found that it had a little jack in the back where I could plug in my guitar and play out of the set speakers. Every Saturday morning, when my brother was playing baseball and my parents were at work, I'd plug in and watch cartoons like Mighty Mouse and Winky Dink and You and make up musical soundtracks to go with them. Dad would boast about me to people at the plant. "My youngest boy has a great ear," he'd say proudly. "I think he could be a natural." One day he overheard one of his buddies complain that he had bought his daughter an electric guitar that she never played. "The thing just sits in her closet gathering dust," he moaned. "Oh yeah?" Dad commented, knowing that I had already outgrown the silver tone. He came home later that night and told me about the electric guitar, but warned, "When we go over there to take a look at it, act like you don't really care." The minute I set eyes on that guitar, a cream and gold Fender Music Maker in a little tweed case, our cover was blown. Dad knew from the expression on my face that he'd never get a good deal now. It was probably the cheapest Fender money could buy, and with its gold pickguard, it looked like a girl's guitar, but I was in love. I wanted it so bad, especially when I saw it came with a little amplifier not much bigger than a shelf radio. I proudly took it home and played it so much my fingers bled. Dad helped me upgrade the amp to a Fender Deluxe, which was really something. Now all I had to do was improve my performance. I practiced, and as soon as I thought I was good enough, I took myself off to the State Theater movie house, where on Saturday mornings most of the kids in Gainesville could be found watching a 25-cent movie like Creature from the Black Lagoon or King Kong. Most weeks the theater also put on a live talent show immediately after the film. Many of the kids would go early and pay their quarter and get more for their money, a movie, and a bit of amateur talent. I was just 11 years old, my white blonde hair slicked to one side, wearing my best Sunday shirt and pants, when I stood up on that stage for my first public performance. A chill fear gripped my heart. I was so nervous that I had a sheen of sweat on my as-of-yet hairless upper lip. My shirt was sticking to the skin on my back, and my face turned bright pink. Placing my fingers in the correct positions with the utmost concentration, I played the opening bars of Red River Valley, a seminal American country song I had heard played by Porter Wagoner a dozen times on the Grand Ole Opry. It wasn't exactly Elvis, but I didn't yet have the courage to publicly perform the moves I'd practiced for hours alone in my bedroom. There were only a few people in the crowd I knew. The rest were complete strangers, and in some ways that made it easier. They sat hunched in their seats, talking and laughing, drinking sodas and throwing popcorn at each other while I played. I didn't sing or anything. I couldn't. I had little or no confidence in my voice back then, and in any event, I could never have generated enough saliva to lubricate my vocal cords. Nor could I stop my mouth from moving strangely while I was playing the most difficult parts on the frets. You're not the only one, Don. I just hoped that anyone sitting near the front would think I was mouthing the words to myself. The reception to my standing there stiffly playing guitar was less than enthusiastic, but after a while a small silence fell, and I noticed that some of the kids were actually listening. Allowing myself a little smile, I relaxed into it and began to play with more confidence. I even strayed slightly from the song, injecting a touch of personal improvisation. There was hardly a standing ovation as I went into the last chorus, but I wasn't being booed, and they weren't throwing paper cups at me, which I knew was a good sign. As I heard the final chord echo away, I focused on a couple of pretty young girls in the second row who were, for some unknown reason, beaming back at me with a look of adulation. I knew that this was what I had to do. Stumbling off the stage in a daze, as if I'd just woken up from a long sleep, it wasn't as if I had a choice. From that day on, my life would never be the same. Puberty was, for me, an agony of teenage confusion. Hair sprouted, bones grew, skin erupted, my voice broke, "Hey guys, you want to play some baseball?" And all manners of alarming thoughts stole into my head. Ripples of heat would pass through my body at the very thought of a girl. A close encounter with the likes of Sharon Pringle probably would have killed me. Along with the physical changes came unforeseen psychological ones, like not appreciating how impoverished my family was until my first day at F.W. Butchholes High School. Almost overnight, I discovered completely new areas of embarrassment, just by looking around at other people's clothes, bikes, and even cars, and comparing them with my own painfully visible lack of assets. I came to understand what I was: dirt poor. And with that realization came a searing, scorching shame. Friends like Kenny Gibbs, whose father owned the furniture store in town, lived in new cinder block houses with air conditioning, something I could only dream about. I found myself spending more and more time over at his place, enjoying the permanently cool air, along with unimagined luxuries like a color television and a refrigerator full of candy bars and Coca-Colas we could help ourselves to. I readily accepted an offer from his mother to sleep over, just for the novelty of not lying in a pool of sweat. I rarely, if ever, invited Kenny back to my house in return, or anyone else for that matter. I usually made the excuse that Mom was home or my brother was studying. Everything about my parents suddenly seemed excruciating to my teenage mind. Their English seemed very broken. They weren't articulate like other people's parents, and I felt that the minute anyone met them, they'd know I came from limited means. Every now and again, my family background would rear up and threaten to expose me. If someone asked me a personal question like, "Isn't your dad a mechanic at Copper's?" or "Didn't I see your mom in the thrift shop?" But I usually managed to quash it before it was too late. Music, ever my escape route, continued to be my salvation. I couldn't afford my own records to keep up with the latest sounds, so I listened to the radio endlessly. I had an old wooden one in my room, which quickly absorbed any attention I might otherwise have given to homework. In Gainesville, most of the white-owned stations stopped broadcasting at sundown. If the weather was good and there wasn't a big storm between Florida and Tennessee, I could wiggle the antenna around until I picked up WLAC in Nashville at 1510 on the AM dial, and the only station playing black music. Through its crackly broadcast hosted by Gene Nobles, I was introduced to legends like B.B. King, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and Muddy Waters. Tired of Pat Boone's mind-numbing version of Tutti Frutti all day on the regular channels, I'd listen at night, open-mouthed, to Little Richard strutting his stuff, with my hair greased to one side and my jeans pegged in on my mother's pedal singer sewing machine. I started getting into the North Florida music scene in a serious way. I took a lead from Dad and began to borrow other people's records: Elvis, Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, and his Comets. In fact, just about everything from the dawn of rock and roll. Using Dad's voice of music machine, I'd record them on one channel while I played guitar on the other, trying to mimic the rock and roll greats. Once my dad upgraded to a better studio, I requisitioned his old one and carried it carefully to my bedroom, giving up all thoughts of academic study to spend my nights devoted to music. My second public performance came when I was 14. I entered a talent contest at junior high school and walked onto the stage alone with a guitar and an amp. "Okay now, boys and girls, let's hear a rousing round of applause for our next contestant, Donald Felder," the host announced, feedback screaming through his mic. I was far more nervous than my last gig, chiefly because I now knew everyone in the audience. But I somehow managed to play Walk, Don't Run by the Ventures well enough to be recognizable. There was a crowd of about 500, and the reaction was surprising. They seemed to like me, and by the end of the gig, I acquired newfound status. My peers were at the age where, like me, they were identifying with their rock and roll heroes, and I suddenly found that, as the nearest Gainesville equivalent, I had fans. Best of all, some of them were girls. With my fair complexion and lean looks, I was apparently considered a catch, now that I had proven musical talent. Needless to say, I reveled in my new cool. 3 weeks after that performance, one of my teachers suggested that I contact the local radio station, WGGG, which regularly aired Gainesville Best Amateurs. He came with me, and because he knew one of the DJs, fixed it for me to play live. Standing in a tiny recording studio in front of a microphone, I hammered out 2 instrumental songs, Apache, written by Jerry Lorden, and popularized by The Shadows, and my old standby, Walk, Don't Run. A few of my friends heard the broadcast. "You done good, Don," they told me. "It was real neato." They made me feel like someone, like Elvis even. I was amazed even then how just stepping up to the microphone affected the way people viewed me. The DJ, a guy called Jim, whose full-time job was as a driver for the local Williams Thomas funeral home, offered to help me make up some tapes. He and I became good friends and used to hang out in the viewing room of the funeral parlor at night playing frisbee beside the plinth where the open casket stood. I put together a small band at school with Kenny Gibbs and his brother, and we practiced regularly in their garage. His mother wanted us to call ourselves the Moonbeams, but we thought that name sucked. I can't remember what we decided on in the end, but we eventually evolved into the Continentals. It was sort of my band. I put it together and had cards made up with my telephone number on it for bookings. As was the nature of teenage bands in a college town, players came and went as they dropped in and out of Gainesville for their studies. Kenny played bass for a while, not because he was particularly talented, he just looked good and pulled in the girls. He also had the money to buy equipment, which was vital. There were 2 other bass players who were much better, Barry Scoran, a college student from Miami, and a guy named Stan Stanel. I'd go over to Stan's house for a rehearsal, and he'd be sitting on his bed in his underwear for hours, foot propped up on a little stool, reading sheet music for classical guitar. He was a phenomenal player, but if you put an electric guitar in his hand, it sounded awful. The only thing that worked for him was bass, because of the similarities with classical technique. He played with us for about a year and then moved on, ending up as head of the guitar department of the Boston Conservatory of Music. I had probably one of the best classical guitar players in the country playing bass in my teenage rock and roll band, and I didn't even know it. The other players in the band's various incarnations included a drummer named Jeff Williams, a freshman at the university who fixed us some great bookings for fraternity players. We lied about our age. Lee Chipley, a sax player, and a guitarist and singer called Joe Mastro. The most itinerant of all was a young man who arrived in Gainesville out of the blue. He met Jeff at a gig and asked if he could recommend somewhere to stay. I ran into this kid at a frat party, and he sings and plays real good rhythm guitar. "I think he should be in our band," Jeff told us one day. "Great, what's his name?" "Steven," Jeff replied. "Steven Stills." Jeff was right. Steven had one of the most distinctive voices I had ever heard. He was 15, with short blonde hair, incredibly funny, outgoing and confident. The type who'd sit with a guitar and play and sing by himself without any qualms. He had a rebellious, independent streak in him, but he wasn't off the tracks. I don't think he had been especially bad to warrant being sent to a military academy. He was just caught more often than the rest of us. He lived at Jeff's house for a while, and we wound up doing some shows together, with him as the newest member of the Continentals. One night we did a gig at the Palatka Prom, and stayed overnight in a hotel room with 2 double beds. I think we got a lift to the gig in the back of someone's pickup truck. Somehow, even though we were underage, we managed to get a hold of a bottle of Jack Daniels. Steven and Kenny and Jeff and I ended up jumping up and down on those double beds, screaming at the top of our voices, like kids who had been left alone in the house by themselves. We were laughing and bouncing around, breaking bed springs, and having a gas. It was probably one of my fondest memories of that whole time. Next thing I knew, Steven was gone. He just disappeared without an explanation or a goodbye. I always assumed his trail had started getting hot, but I heard later that he took off for Tampa and then Latin America when his family moved there. Whatever the reason, he just evaporated. I didn't think I'd ever see or hear from him again. In the summer of '61, Dad drove me to Daytona Beach to see Mr. Guitar, Chet Atkins, in concert, a legend of Nashville and later a guitar designer for Gibson and Gretsch. Dad and I went alone on a rare outing together. The gig was amazing. I sat open-mouthed as Chet captivated an audience of 2,000 or 3,000 fans, just him and his guitar. Not only did he use an incredible syncopated thumb and finger technique, but he developed a routine of playing different tunes with his left and right hands simultaneously. On the lower strings he'd play Yankee Doodle, and on the upper, Dixie. It was like the North and South finally reunited. I was dazzled and started borrowing his records from friends, copying them religiously. I learned by ear, listening where each note was, guessing the fingering. I couldn't afford sheet music. I figured that if I recorded stuff on Dad's tape machine at 7.5 inches per second and played it back at 3 3/4, it would be an octave down, but the same key and the same tonality, just half as fast. That way I could listen string by string, pick by pick, finger by finger. I tried to get my speed up to where I could actually play it in unison with Chet. I must have struggled with that Yankee Doodle / Dixie piece for over a year, working on it for a couple of hours every day, but I still couldn't figure it out. One night I'd had enough and threw my guitar down on the bed in disgust. I went off to sleep, and somehow during the night my brain ran the sequences and came up with the solution. In the morning I picked up the guitar, and to my complete amazement, I had it, note perfect. Not that my entire life revolved around music. There were plenty of other distractions for a boy teetering on the brink of manhood. First, I had earned some money to pay for tapes and guitar strings. Along with paid chores for the neighbors, I took a Saturday position working for Sharon Pringle's father in his shoe store on the corner of Main Street, right opposite the Five and Dime. It was an absolutely miserable job for a horny young man to be in, kneeling at the feet of all these pretty young girls, inhaling their scent as they tried on shoes, my face coloring scarlet every time they spoke to me. I didn't last long. The pain was too much to bear. My next job was working at the new music store in town. Lipham Music opened in the shopping center just down from the old drugstore, the only place I could buy guitar strings previously, run by old man Lipham and his son Buster. The new store was revolutionary for Gainesville and its big band fans. There wasn't a saxophone, trombone, or piano in sight, just guitars and sheet music. It was truly a symbol of the new rock and roll era. Walking past one day, I stopped in my tracks and stared hard into the window. There, almost as if it were waiting for me, was a Fender Stratocaster, just like the one Buddy Holly played, right in front of my eyes, in Gainesville. It was pretty beat up and could do with some work, but it was for sale, and I simply had to have it. Pushing open the door, I hovered around the edges of the shop until Mr. Lipham finally approached. "Can I help you, son?" he asked, a bemused smile on his face. "I'd like to buy the Fender Stratocaster in the window," I said, all in a rush. "I have a Fender Music Maker to trade in its original case, and I don't have any money right now, but I could pay you something every week." Mr. Lipham rubbed his chin with his hand and looked me up and down. "Can you play?" he asked suspiciously. "Yes, sir," I volunteered confidently. "Show me," he replied, reaching for a used guitar from the rack. I slung the string around my neck and duly gave him a sample of my rapidly expanding repertoire. How about paying me off at the rate of $10 a month?" he asked when I had finished. Seeing me falter, he added, "You can work here when you can, tuning and cleaning the guitars, clearing up, and showing people how to play. I'll pay you $1.50 an hour." "Sure," I beamed, and within an hour, I was back home in my room, banging the life out of that old Stratocaster. My job in the store soon extended to that of music teacher. Mr. Lippin recommended me to some of his customers, and before I knew it, I was teaching 10-year-old snot-nosed kids who whined all the time because their fingers hurt, and they thought they'd be able to play like Elvis the minute they picked up the guitar their parents had just bought them. My salary doubled, and I soon paid off the Stratocaster, even if the price, working with children, often seemed too high. One of my students, however, showed real promise. His name was Tommy Petty, and he was my star pupil. Tommy was 3 years younger than me, skinny, with buck teeth, and an awful guitar. I went over to his house to give him lessons, and he had a microphone set up and was belting it out, standing in his living room, singing and playing for all he was worth. I was impressed. Tommy wasn't an outstanding guitar player, but he had a voice somewhere between Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan, and a whole lot of nerve. Not long afterward, he became the lead singer with a band called the Rucker Brothers. I remember telling Tommy that one day he might even make it, and he did. I advised his band on improving their guitar techniques and helped put together some of their arrangements. Sometimes I'd even travel with them on a gig, standing in the audience to hear them play. Tommy was very good looking, with long silky hair he used to flip, which attracted the girls. While I was standing watching him perform in a moose lodge one night, a real cute chick came up and started talking to me. She had seen me help unload the band's equipment and knew I was with them. To my surprise and delight, she invited me to go for a ride in her car during the break, and of course, I agreed. She drove down the road a little bit and pulled over, and we started kissing. But before anything serious happened, a car pulled up beside hers, and a young man, as drunk as could be, started yelling at us. "Oh, Lord, it's my boyfriend!" she screamed, pushing me away from her. Ashen-faced, I watched as this linebacker pulled up in front of us, stepped out, and walked back along the asphalt road in the middle of nowhere, a murderous expression on his face. Happily for me, he was so drunk he suddenly tripped and collapsed, face down, in the road. "Quick, start the car!" I yelled at the girl. "Let's get the out of here." "We can't just leave him there," she whined. "He's lying right in the middle of the road. Someone's going to hit him. We got to pull him to the side." With severe doubts about my sanity, I climbed out of the car and helped her get her boyfriend to his feet. As we pulled him up, he belched foul beer breath. Reluctantly, I placed one of his arms around my shoulders and one around hers, and we started dragging him back toward his car. We were only a few feet from safety when he came to. "Get your filthy hands off me," he said, throwing back his arms with a violent jerk, completely dislocating my left shoulder. Letting out a primal scream, I grabbed my arm and jammed it back into his socket. "Take me back to the gig," I gasped at the girl. She took one look at her boyfriend, now slumped over the hood of his car, and another look at me, doubled up in pain, and agreed. I staggered back into the Moose Lodge halfway through the second set, holding my shoulder, which hurt real bad, and tried to make my way up the stage to ask one of the guys to take me to a hospital. A few steps behind me was the Drunken Boyfriend, who regained consciousness and followed me back. "Hey, you little jerk," he yelled, shoving me hard in the back. "What the are you doing with my girl?" I couldn't defend myself. My shoulder was all swollen, and I was in so much pain I could have cried. The Rucker brothers, though, were big, bad, mean, tough Florida rednecks whose father owned a garage. They saw me being harassed, threw down their instruments, jumped down off the stage, grabbed this guy, and dragged him outside, where they gave him a good whooping. That was probably one of the most memorable Tom Petty gigs I can recall. Even today, if I pull my shoulder back a little too far, I get a painful reminder of that night. My schoolwork undoubtedly suffered from all the extracurricular activities I was involved in addition to my weekend job selling shoes and tuning guitars and trying to teach tearful little kids how to play King Creole. I also started doing solo gigs, just me, my Fender, and my little amp, playing in town and at venues farther afield, which I rode to on a Greyhound bus. Don Felder, guitarist, I billed myself, taking lowly paid jobs at women's social clubs and kids' parties, playing anything from movie themes to Elvis. I also played drums in a band called Gatorland, which was right across the street from the University of Florida, and lead guitar in a band at Dub's Steer Room, a smoke-filled steakhouse that served meat and beer. You can shoot pool, dance the gator, or just watch the wet t-shirt contest every Friday and Saturday night. Man, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Jerry didn't like me playing in such places, and when he found out, he threatened to tell our folks. "It ain't right," he'd tell me. "You're underage, and you shouldn't even be in those dives. Besides, it's embarrassing having my kid brother on the stage." But I didn't care. I was happy playing music and having fun. Ever since I'd stepped on the stage at the State Theater, this was what I had wanted. I still love black music. After my early contact with the church soul singers and my love affair with late-night radio stations, but during the late 50s and early 60s, there weren't any concert halls for black artists. Racism was rife in the Deep South, and that's just how it was. I didn't like it, and I didn't understand it. My father worked with colors and got on well with them. One of my dad's friends, known to all as Pig, had a sugar cane farm outside town. We'd sometimes go there on weekends and work alongside his men cutting the cane. Pig's mule would pull the grindstone, and the coloreds would cook up some of the sugar cane to make syrup for our pancakes. Dad lent money to one man in particular, who was a regular visitor at our home. I was always mystified as to why. When he came to call, he had to use the back door instead of the front. There was a part of Gainesville that everybody called Colored Town. Whites didn't go there, but I did. I'd sneak out as a young teenager and run down to the bars to jam with the musicians. My parents would have had a fit if ever they knew. My father was still taking his belt to me, and I dread to think what he'd have done if he'd ever found out I wasn't sleeping over at a friend's house, after all, but hanging out with the Colors. One of the musicians I played with down there, a drummer called John, told me that B.B. King was coming to town as part of what was known as the Chitlin Circuit for black performers. He'd been playing in an illegal bar in a barn out of somebody's farm. Back then, promoters would find a building in the middle of cow pastures and simply move the haystacks out of the way for the gig. They'd set up tables and chairs made out of crates and put down a few kegs, sell beer, and charge $5 admission. $5 to see B.B. King? It was a small fortune. I was completely starstruck about B.B., whom I'd heard on WALC 100 times, and I badgered John to take me with him. Please, can I go? Please, please, please. He eventually agreed, much to my delight, and so one night I sneaked out of my house, ran to his Jeep, and drove off with him to the barn. The place was steaming. I was the only white person for miles. I couldn't afford to go in, so I stayed outside, peering through the window. BB absolutely blew me away. Men were hollering and women were crying just listening to him play. I watched him wide-eyed and knew that I wanted to be like him more than anything else in the world, standing at the front of the stage, eyes pressed shut, making women weep with my guitar. When he was done, he set down his guitar in a horse stall and took a seat on a hay bale, along with everybody else, to drink some of the illegal booze. My heart pounding, I burst in through the door and rushed across the crowded barn to where he was sitting. Mr. King, I said breathlessly, I just want to shake your hand. His face lit up like a candle, and he flashed me a mouth filled with dazzling white teeth. Well, okay, boy, he replied, his eyes bright. Here it is. He extended his huge hand and took it with mine. His fingers were the size of sausages, and his breath smelled faintly of whiskey. Unable to say another word, dumbstruck as his gaze cut through me, I backed away and walked home that night in a daze. I don't think I washed for a week. For the next few months, I saved every penny until finally I could afford what I wanted. The first album I ever bought was Live at the Regal by B.B. King. I bought it in mail order from Randy's record shop in Gatlin, Tennessee, advertised on WLAC in Nashville as the world's largest phonographic record shop. The album cost $2.98. Can you believe that? Which I painstakingly saved and sent off in the mail. It was one of the greatest blues recordings ever made. I learned every note. World events largely seemed to pass Gainesville by, but some, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of President Kennedy, were unavoidable. I was in high school when JFK and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced off over nuclear warheads being located in Cuba in the fall of 1962. The name Castro became as synonymous with evil as Osama bin Laden is today. There was a small speaker on the wall in the corner of each classroom, through which we'd hear the latest news reports on the radio. During daily air raid drills, we'd hide under our desks when a siren went off. The announcement would say, "This is a test. This is just a test. In case of a real emergency, go to your designated area." And it would be followed by a series of loud blasts on a horn. The teacher would say, "Okay now, children, remember the procedure. Hats on, heads down, eyes shut." As if our plywood desk and tin hats would have saved us from a nuclear holocaust. I remember wondering how long it would take me to run home if a missile hit Florida. It was a time of national fear, and the first casualty was logic. Some people in our neighborhood tried to build bomb shelters, but with the water table just 3 feet under the soil, they quickly realized that they'd drown before they'd be nuked. The threat of war seemed unreal and almost fun, as though we were being involved in something fantastical, not about to disappear under a giant mushroom cloud. The following year, JFK was shot. That felt entirely different. The news was so unbelievable and earth-shattering. I remember our teacher broke down as she told us in the schoolyard. Everyone seemed suddenly afraid, paranoid even. Adults cried openly on the street, something I had never seen before. It was as if the whole of Gainesville had suddenly been jerked awake from its rose-tinted dream by the firing of that bullet. Nothing felt safe or sure anymore. The apple pie sweetness had gone sour. We were given the day off from school to watch the funeral on television with our families, and I remember sitting on the floor in front of our black and white set and watching little John standing silently by his mother's side at Arlington National Cemetery while my own mother sat sniffling on the couch. Even my father looked wild-eyed. Man, that was strange. Everyone remembers where he was when he heard that JFK was shot. I know I always will. 1963 is indelibly marked in the American psyche, but it was momentous for another reason for me. It was the year I met the man who was to become one of the most pivotal to my whole life. His name was Bernie Whedon. That's the end of Chapter 3. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 3 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.